Earlier today, I spoke with the family of Breonna Taylor. This morning, they were informed that the Justice Department has charged 4 current and former Louisville Metro Police Department officers with federal crimes related to Ms. Taylor's death. Those alleged crimes include civil rights offenses, unlawful conspiracies, unconstitutional use of force, and obstruction offenses.
You guys remember Breonna Taylor? Because I was concerned that everyone had forgotten about the insane and unjust way she was gunned down by cops who indiscriminately shot bullets into her apartment. But luckily today, federal officials charged 4 current and former police officers in Louisville, Kentucky, who were involved in that fatal raid on her apartment. Now, these are the first federal charges against any officer involved in the raid, and they do accuse them of several crimes, including lying to obtain a warrant. Finally, I remember covering the story and being so outraged that no one was focusing on the lie that was told to obtain the warrant for the raid in the first place. But there's more. It also accuses them of, other acts that led to her death, which I'm gonna detail for you right now. So here's a reminder of what happened for those of you who need that refresher, because it did happen 2 years ago. During the nighttime raid in March of 2020, officers knocked down the door and fired a volley of gunshots after Breonna Taylor's boyfriend shot an officer in the leg, believing that intruders had burst into the home. I think anyone would have that kind of reaction, right? Because it's a raid, it's a no-knock warrant, they burst into the home, and in self-defense, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend shoots his gun. 2 officers shot Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency room technician, who was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, what spurred this raid in the first place? It's important to understand this context. So the cops had been investigating 2 men who they believed were selling drugs out of a house that was far from Taylor's. Okay, so this is all about drug trafficking, which, by the way, no-knock warrants for drug trafficking, I think, is something that should be reconsidered, to say the least. But the cops said they believed that one of those men had used her apartment, Breonna Taylor's apartment, to receive the packages, and that's how they got the warrant for the raid. But here's the important part. Neither of the officers who shot and killed Taylor have ever been charged, nor are they named in the new indictments. The charges instead name 3 officers who were part of an investigative unit that obtained the search warrant for the raid, along with a 4th officer who was later fired from the department because, officials said, he had fired blindly into Taylor's apartment and struck a neighboring apartment. They were more concerned about the neighboring apartment than the fact that Breonna Taylor had been gunned down as an innocent individual who was in that apartment during this terrible raid. That former officer, by the way, the one who shot indiscriminately, Brett Hankison, already faced state criminal charges in that case, but those were the only charges that were ever filed until Thursday. But he was acquitted. The new indictment accuses him of federal civil rights violations. Now here is Merrick Garland explaining some of the charges in more detail.
The federal charges announced today allege that members of the Place-Based Investigations Unit falsified the affidavit used to obtain the search warrant of Ms. Taylor's home, that this act violated federal civil rights laws, and that those violations resulted in Ms. Taylor's death. Specifically, we allege that Ms. Taylor's 4th Amendment rights were violated when defendants Joshua Janes, Kyle Meany, and Kelly Goodlatte sought a warrant to search Ms. Taylor's home, knowing that the officers lacked probable cause for the search. We allege that the defendants knew the affidavit in support of that warrant contained false and misleading information, and that it omitted material information.
And he's right about that. For instance, prosecutors said on Thursday that 2 detectives and a police sergeant had falsely claimed in this affidavit used to obtain the warrant that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend had been receiving packages at Taylor's apartment. In fact, according to the indictment, the officers had no evidence of such packages, but misrepresented their case to the judge who authorized the raid. In fact, they claimed in order to obtain the warrant for the raid that they had spoken to the Postal Service about the packages that were being sent to Breonna Taylor. But later, a representative of the post office came out and said, no one ever said that. That is a lie. That is completely made up. And that element of the story drove me crazy because no one seemed to be focusing on that. And that was a huge, huge lie that led to the warrant that was used for this raid that ended up killing Breonna Taylor. One of the officers charged, Joshua Janes, a former detective who was also fired over his role in the raid, sent a draft of the affidavit to Kelly Goodlett, another detective now facing charges in which he included the false claim about the packages, the prosecutors said. And prosecutors are alleging that those officers were aware that they had included false and misleading information to obtain the warrant. The third officer charged, Sergeant Kyle Meany, who led the department's investigative unit, approved the affidavit despite knowing that it contained the false information according to the indictment. But somehow, if you don't think this is bad enough, it's about to get worse. Let's watch.
The charges announced today also allege that the officers responsible for falsifying the affidavit that led to the search took steps to cover up their unlawful conduct after Ms. Taylor was killed. We also allege that they conspired to mislead federal, state, and local authorities who were investigating the incident. For example, we allege that in May 2020, those 2 defendants met in a garage where they agreed to tell investigators a false story.
Just absolutely disgusting. Falsifying whatever they need to falsify in order to obtain the warrant in the first place. The raid ends up killing an innocent woman in her own apartment. And then there's a cover up, according to what Merrick Garland said there after the fact. And Emma, I'm wondering if you think that there will be a more receptive reaction to ensuring that justice be served for Breonna Taylor, especially now that it's abundantly clear that cops do in fact engage in cover-ups. We see it playing out in Uvalde after the cops, of course, got a lot of backlash in the way that they failed to respond to a mass shooter on that campus in Uvalde, Texas. What do you think is gonna come of this?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be cynical, right? Because this is a good thing that Merrick Garland and the Biden administration is doing here. But at the same time, I mean, I'm happy to know Merrick Garland's alive, right?
I know.
Like, I know. There could be a lot more being done right now. And I'm a bit unsatisfied by a piecemeal approach to targeting corrupt cops, because this is not a few bad apples, and going after these cops that falsified documents and tried to cover up their murder. That's what happened of Breonna Taylor. Or at least killing, I should say, to protect myself legally, whatever. But they, at the very least, I understand that they should be targeted, but they are not a few bad apples, as I say. This is what is incentivized in policing in this country. And I remain incredibly frustrated by Democrats who like to fundraise off of 3 issues pretty much over the past 5 years, which is abortion access, which is gun violence, and which is anti-racism, right? I mean, during Black Lives Matter, there were a lot of fundraising emails that were sent out, and yet there's been no legislative response on really any of those fronts. And the gun violence bill that was just the bipartisan group of senators came together on is garbage as well. So I'm happy that these cops should face some consequences for what was done here, but I think that there needs to be a larger focus on how we can prevent more Breonna Taylors from being killed by cops. And that's not making an example out of people. We understand that that doesn't work. There have been police brutality incidents since George Floyd, since Breonna Taylor. There has to be an end to qualified immunity. There has to be a restructuring of policing in this country, which includes reallocating funds into different kinds of community programs that, cops aren't at traffic stops with guns and using these excuses as a way to terrorize Black people in their community. I mean, most cops in some of these areas view themselves as an occupying force. And that's because they've been emboldened to act as such towards non-white populations by governments. And that is what has to change, in my opinion.
Yeah, with what we're experiencing right now with a crime wave, I would argue that reforming policing is the single most important thing to do, because what we're seeing is, obviously distrust in cops. I think that the protests have led to an unofficial strike by police in the middle of a crime wave to make a point. And you're right, it's a system that's rotten to its core. And we really, really do need to reform it in order to respond appropriately to the crime wave, in order to ensure that communities feel safe under the, protection of cops that are actually interested in protecting and serving. And more importantly, policing needs to be rethought, at least in the very least, in regard to how they've been militarized as a result of our defense spending. That is a huge problem as well. I think part of the reason why they see themselves as an occupying force is because they have the military weaponry that an occupying force would have. And that's because we spend so much on defense to enrich weapons manufacturers and private defense contractors. The military ends up having a massive inventory and surplus of this weaponry, of the tanks, and all that military capability gets passed off to local police departments. So yeah, they're gonna see themselves as an occupying force. And disadvantaged communities, poor people, people of color, they're the ones who bear the brunt of this broken system. So while it's okay, I think, to celebrate the fact that Merrick Garland is alive and he's actually doing something, and maybe there will be some justice for the family of Breonna Taylor. At the end of the day, it's focusing on a specific incident rather than doing more to reform the entire system.
Yeah,
all right, well,
the fish is militarized from the head down. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.